Hi all, let's have a look at Game 7 of the World Chess Championship. So Magnus Carlsen playing against Fabiano Caruana. So Magnus with the white pieces, d4. We have knight f6, knight f3, d5, c4, e6. So Queen's Gambit declined territory. This is following, at the moment, Game 2 of the match with the bishop f4 variation. So who will spring a surprise first? Black castles, e3, c5. And we're still repeating game 2. D takes c5, bishop takes c5, queen c2, knight c6, a3, queen a5. And so there are tricks from game 2. Just to mention one of them, b4. There's always bishop takes b4 because of the pin there. So the same tactics. If you look at game 2, there's a lot of analysis as well of this particular position. I'll give a link to that in the pinned comment of this video. So here, though, in game 2, we saw actually the move rook d1, and then rook d8 was played, which took Magnus Carlsen by surprise. That was in game 2, and he had an interesting facial expression. And this actually historically dated back to Erwer versus Cooper and Petrosian versus Lutikov. So there's some stem games from over 30 years ago from those players, but that's also game 2. But here we see knight d2. So knight d2. This does mean that there's a knight b3 idea, forking queen and bishop sometimes. And yes, Fabiano springs a kind of surprise with queen d8. There's only 2 references officially in ChessBase Livebook compared to 160 for the move bishop e7 here. So bishop e7 has been seen a lot more frequently than queen d8. So for example, rook d1, e5, black gets quite aggressive in the center. It's a very different beast, this position, with black expanding in the center and preparing to kick this knight sometimes on b3. That's stopped, and then g6 we have this wild position, but we have a very different nature of the position now with queen d8 being played. So perhaps this is the first little surprise move, given its infrequency in ChessBase compared to bishop e7. So knight b3, and again a slight surprise which takes us totally out of book, actually out of charted territories as far as I'm aware. Bishop b6, well, on my database anyway. Bishop e7 has been seen before in a fairly high level game, Golod against Gershowicz, played in Halifa 2008, and that ended in a win for white after bishop e7. There was rook d1. Let's have a quick look at that game. And so black got to kick the knight on b3, and white developed some attacking pressure soon. Yeah, the queen went to a1. This is remarkable. Queen on a1. But pressure on this diagonal, potentially. Nice blockade on d4. And then the bishops seem to be quite attacking here. White crashed through on the queen side a bit. f7 attacked, yes, and black got into very serious trouble and resigned here. The rook is trying to deflect the queen away from f7. Because of queen takes f7 and mating. So yeah, white, that's checkmate there because the bishop's covering the escape. So that was a very exciting game with bishop e7 before in 2008. Also bishop d6 has been played by less rated players overall, but here, yeah, we're going into really uncharted territory with bishop b6. And on the surface it seems, isn't this a little bit odd, putting the queen back on d8, because surely a move like rook d1 is a really nice kind of x-ray on the queen and pinning that pawn. So maybe this is why it isn't seen that much. Okay, so what has black got up his sleeve here to put the queen back on d8? And in fact, if you think about it, Caruana's moves are actually all focused on d4. They say strong players focus on the center, but it's actually the d4 square for both of these pieces, which is the attraction, it seems, the central attraction. Bishop e2, we have queen e7, and this is asking for a pin, really. Now that the bishop's over here, it really is tempting to pin this knight, yeah, because sometimes, well, usually you'd think that would be nice to play bishop e7. So what is black up to here? We have a very strong threat now of c takes and a knight takes d5. So black is compelled to do something about this and plays d takes c4. Now, here, if bishop takes c4, black gains a tempo with knight e5, and then gains another tempo, and then a third tempo here, knight g6. And this should be a fairly nice position for black, liberating the problem bishop across this diagonal. This seems to be fairly equal. If we have a look at this again, on h6, bishop h4, knight g6, it's pointless white playing bishop takes f6 here. In fact, in this structure, it seems black can even consider g takes f6, a bit like a Bern variation of the French, where the g file might actually be very nice for black to use later. And with that dark square bishop around without a counterpart, this is actually quite dangerous for white to do this just for a bit of structural damage. So we see actually, no temptation to take on f6. We see actually knight d2, now knight e5, and here Magnus Carlsen counseled. He said it's like an admission that white doesn't have much, and soon after castling, it seems all the actors basically leave the stage one by one. If this was a play, it's like the actors are just leaving quite rapidly after this. So while they're all on in this position, there are some interesting variations here revolving around this pinned knight to explore. And Carlsen himself mentioned f4. This is a really big forcing move, but of course it fundamentally weakens the e3 pawn. It turns out black should really ideally play knight d3 check. For example, this position should be an even position with no real issues. If black doesn't sacrifice the pawn with knight d3 check, well, this pawn's going to be taken anyway, and in fact, white could end up with a small edge here. Believe it or not, white could end up with a small edge in this position. Queen's coming off again, but it is a nice edge here. But so f4, but black just plays basically knight d3 check as the antidote, leaving e3 fundamentally weak. But the other interesting try, which is more interesting here to consider, is trying to celebrate this pin in this position while the bishop's over here. And that can actually be done with two different knight moves, but one is actually much better than the other. Knight ce4 not only puts pressure on the pin, it vacates c3 for the queen to join in, potentially on f6. And this leads to quite a sharp variation. Bishop d7, queen c3. But now if the knight goes back, it's a disaster. So let's imagine the knight goes back, then yes, the pressure on f6, it's just a total disaster. Bishop takes f6 or knight takes f6. This looks absolutely devastation. For example, double check, and it's a total could end up getting mated. But black doesn't have any of that. Doesn't have to do any of that. After this, black, it's a relative pin and it can be broken. Relative pins are there to be broken. They're not absolute pins. And in fact, black plays knight takes e4 here, hitting the queen. And after, say, knight takes e4 to keep the pressure on the queen, because if bishop takes, then knight takes c3, and that's fine. That's very good for black. So let's just continue here with knight takes e4, f6. But now, can you see what white can play if I give you 5 seconds? And perhaps Magnus had calculated all of this and just rejected it. Queen takes e5. And we have a sharp line here. With black's structure, it seems to be completely wrecked here. Well, double pawns, but especially the isolated pawn on e6 would seem to be a target. And the engines here I'm not convinced actually that it's anything more than an even position. Even with this super sharp tactics, it could still fizzle out into a kind of even position, believe it or not. So yeah, this is interesting. So this is an interesting way to play it with putting pressure on that pin. The other way is not as effectual actually. If white plays knight d-e4, then again, black can consider having the double pawns here and actually can get into the driving seat in this position. The bishop maneuvers along this fine diagonal, and this could be quite problematic for white. If we look at this continuation, if white's castling queenside as well, g2 could even be taken, and black actually is the one with a big advantage. So yeah, there is some interesting stuff going on just before this castling moment. Yeah, on knight e5. So either f4 or this trying to, exploit this pinned piece on f6. So yeah, Magnus must have checked all of this out. Just to check this line again. So this is like the critical one. On bishop c7 here, knight takes, g takes. You'll see that the bishop's supporting e5 now, so there's no queen e5. This position actually could be quite nice for white. Yeah, this could end up to be a big advantage for white actually. But yeah, black just has to play the critical continuation here. So knight c e4, bishop d7, queen c3 just takes, and that should be okay. So anyway, after castling, yeah, it's it's like a rapid series of pieces coming off, believe it or not. It's a symmetrical pawn structure, and maybe that has some influence over what's about to happen. Bishop f4 is played here. On knight takes c4, knight takes, bishop takes. This position should be even. As long as that bishop issue is resolved, black hasn't got too many concerns. So bishop f4, we have knight g6 being played. On knight d3, in fact, this is an interesting test. What would white do here? It's best, it seems, for that knight to be tolerated for a moment on d3, because c4 is weak. For example, like this, put the bishop on f3, and then bang, knight takes c4, and then queen takes d3, leads to an even position. Here, if on knight d3 this is taken immediately, giving up the light square bishop, then there's a little bit of trouble. With black having the light square bishop, this does represent perhaps a slightly more than equal position. It's black's got a slight edge there with the bishop here. So okay, so knight g6 was played though, not testing that. Bishop g3, bishop c6, now knight takes c4. Black preserves and asks for a swap of the dark square bishops, rook fd1, and now with the only shared file, you look at this pawn structure, it's symmetrical on both sides, and with the only shared file, the rooks depart the scene. So things are getting a little bit quieter. Now after knight d5, queen d4, a couple of knights also decide to leave, and then a couple of bishops decide to leave. Queen d7, queen d no, not queen d3. Bishop d3. The queens are not yet ready to leave. So bishop d3. We have the move b6 being played. It turns out here, by the way, even though the queen's looking at d3, there is a tactical move, knight e5, available. So knight takes, queen takes, gives access to b8. So queen takes d3 would be a back row checkmate. That would not usually happen in a World Chess Championship, though. So after knight e5, a more sensible line is here, just doing something else, basically. f6, and if check, this position should be. It looks a little bit dangerous with this battery, but it should be okay, because there's potential for perpetual check from both sides. But so check. If bishop a4, black is the one that can land perpetual checks now. Yeah, it just doesn't seem enough. just with the queens assisted by the bishops, or this bishop actually pinned here. So knight e5 is interesting perhaps for a moment to check out, but f3 blunts the diagonal in advance of any g2 issue. We have bishop b7, and now the bishop and knight here decide to leave. So we have got an imbalance, knight against bishop, and that bishop's blunted. Queen c7. We have e5, queen c5 check, king h2. And now the knight and queen can actually be dangerous. There are many moves that just lead to equality here. But if black overcooked things with queen f2, then there's a big penalty on queen f2. You might think this is attractive because if the queen left f3, then there'll be bishop takes f3. Or sometimes maybe you'd think like this to hit g2. But yeah, this queen f2 is actually a losing move in this position, you might think. Bishop a6 was played, but let's have a quick look at queen f2. Knight d6. And here, let's imagine bishop d5, just to leave around for bishop takes f3. White has check, and believe it or not, knight takes f7 is absolutely winning for white because of this nasty queen h8 checkmate threat. For example, pair queen check and mate. So what does black actually do? If g5, knight takes g5 check, and here the knight is protecting f3, and white can actually play queen g8, and this is winning. So for example, takes check, check, and mate. And if the king went to h5, then check, and then queen f6, checkmate. So yeah, so this is actually one of the only ways it seems to lose the position. I thought I'd point that out for fun. So anyway, so king h2 was played. Sorry, bishop a6 was played, trying to exploit this pinned piece for a moment. Now knight d6, and then now the queens come off in the game. Here, again, if queen f2, let's have a quick look. Queen f2 could actually lead to black having a big advantage there because of g2. But if white's not playing suicidally, then knight e4 to kick the queen, queen c7, and the queen and knight actually coordinate again in a beautiful manner here against the black king. For example, here, check, check, and black would be forced to give up the queen here. And if black doesn't, say king h6, then knight takes f7 check, and then that's checkmate. Yeah, so this is, or king here, and then we have queen h4, for example, checkmate. So yeah, after knight d6, we have queen takes c3, peaceful. A lot of pieces have come off in rapid succession. B takes. Is there any drama left in the position or not? So let's see. So the kings come towards the centre, as they tend to do in endgames. Has this king neglected g2? Bishop f1. The king actually goes back here. Bishop a6, king e3. So, and are they about to have a repetition draw? Well, now bishop f1 was played. Let's say the king tries to go for it with king c6 in this position. This is a what if. Then that leaves behind e8. So white goes into e8. And let's say f takes, g5. White has the crucial move king d4 here, stopping the black king getting to d5. This position could end up in an even position, actually. It just ends up in an even position after bishop takes g2. But it's something to consider, these lines. If knight e8, if king d5, then there's knight c7 check, forking the king and bishop. So big advantage to white. So let's say f takes again, f takes, and we saw g5, but what about... g5 will follow that. If white's too keen to take on g7, then actually black gets a big advantage with king d5. You see that e5 is falling off next, then there's no way to support it here. And the other lines, okay, so bishop f1, knight takes this line leads to, yeah, just an even position, as we mentioned. So yeah, not too much going on. Yeah, both sides still have to be a bit careful. So in the game, bishop f1, king f2, and they actually agreed a draw here. Okay, so the real dramas were behind the scenes, most of them when the pieces were still on, when there was the potential to celebrate the pin on f6. So it seems when Magnus kind of knew that castling was a kind of peaceful outcome, yeah, because there was one shared file for the rooks to depart, then all the other pieces kind of left quite quickly. So anyway, I hope you at least enjoyed some of this analysis. And if you did, click on the top left box to become a member at chessbowl.net. You can play other YouTubers. You can also check this and other game analysis from the improved menu, learn from the masters, and then you click YouTube order button. And sometimes, I will do analysis updates, etc., just to get even more insights. Particularly the more exciting games, I'll drill into a lot more. Okay, comments, questions, donations, see the description. Likes, shares, subscribes with a notification bell, all super appreciated. Thank you very much. Cheers.